But hormone blockers and genital surgery, fine. Talk about a nut allergy. I guess penises are gross now, but one might come in handy later on. And if you're a man who wants to experience life without a pair of balls, you do not have to get surgery. You can get married. Kid. Oh, we joke.
Good morning. It's Wednesday, None Braver Wednesday, January the 17th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we'll have the news shorts, the patriotic shorts, motivational shorts, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, 33 Strategies of War, and an excerpt from the book, None Braver. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now the news shorts.
So you'll find in our big ideas, so that's at arc-invest.com, the building blocks for our price forecast. And our base case is in the $600,000 range. Our bull case, and we think the probability of the bull case has increased with this SEC approval. This is a green light. Our bull case is $1.5 million by 2030. You can see the building blocks. You can see how conservative we are in terms of those building blocks. This is a big idea. It is the first global, decentralized, digital, rules-based, critical there, rules-based monetary system in history. It is a very big idea.
I have an engineer who is an awesome engineer who worked right alongside of the Alaskan Air. They inspected those first few. I asked him to call me the second he was done. And yes, he used that term, loose bolt. Now remember, a loose bolt in an aviation application is a bolt that's under-torqued, or a gap that you can see that is measured in millimeters, not centimeters. It's nevertheless, it has the same implications. So, I understood that from the first moment.
So you're not surprised to hear other reports from United as well as Alaska doing further inspections?
No, well, I'm always surprised at anything that doesn't conform perfectly. On the other hand, it's a fact, and that's what's going on. And I want to know all those facts, and our team wants to know them all. And we're going to want to know what broke down in our gauntlet of inspections, what broke down in the original work that allowed for that escape to happen.
There's always possibilities, and predicting what the Fed's going to do or what the economy is going to do 10 months in advance is very difficult to do. Right now, I think most people would say the hard landing scenario is not really something they're worried about. Like most people would say that the Fed kind of dodged that reasonably well. Maybe the Fed doesn't deserve all the credit. Most people would say the question is whether it's going to be a soft landing, which is what we're looking like we're having, and whether we're going to have really good growth next year. In 2023, the growth rate is probably going to be about 2.5%. Mm-hmm. So we're pulling away from the rest of the world. And when COVID occurred, we were all in trouble. Now, China hasn't really pulled away, and Europe hasn't pulled away. But the United States is really growing quite nicely. I like to think it's because private equity people are giving good techniques to business CEOs and so forth.
That's it.
But whatever the reason is, there's no doubt that the U.S. economy is in a league by itself. Now, it won't stay that way forever. And clearly, if inflation becomes much higher than we expect it will be, there will be a problem. But right now, it seems to be on a downward trajectory.
I think Jay Powell is going to watch the data. And based on the data, Jay Powell will make decisions. The market's clearly running ahead to a position of many cuts. There's no question. We've made a lot of progress on inflation. Depending on how the progress, moves from here, that'll spell the direction of policy. I think it's hard for me to see the market's view of 7 cuts, this year. I do think there's a reasonable possibility of some interest rate cuts and some easing. But it's really going to be dependent on what the data says and how the economy transmits through the year. I see some signs of softness, which would lead you to believe that we're going to see some cuts. But there's a lot going on in the world, and I know you're talking about geopolitics, et cetera, and all of this, can create balances.
0% chance of hikes?
I don't say 0% to anything, but it feels like at this point a bunch of work's done where the chance of hikes is a much smaller distribution than we would have thought, 6 months ago.
What do you think of there's about a dozen big financial companies, Fidelity included.
Number one, I don't care. So just please stop talking about this And I don't know what he would say about blockchain versus currencies that do something versus Bitcoin that does nothing. And maybe that's not different than me. But, this is what makes a market. People have opinions. This is the last time I'm ever going to state my opinion. I think it's a mistake to assume that everything's hunky-dory. And, and when stock markets are up, it's kind of like this little drug we all feel. Like, it's just great, But remember, we've had so much fiscal and monetary stimulation. So I'm a little more on the cautious side that we are facing a lot of things in 24 or 25. And we mentioned Ukraine, the terrorist activity in Israel, the Red Sea, quantitative tightening, which I still question if we understand exactly how that works. I don't think we do. How QE actually worked, what the effect of negative, zero rates was for all this time. And obviously the politics. And, and then the Ukrainian war is affecting oil, gas, food, migration. So you have all these very powerful forces that are going to be affecting us in 24 and 25. So if I was the government, I would be preparing for what I'm going to do about that, assuming things aren't good.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound like it was kind of a begrudging approval. So, on the one hand, I'm glad we have an approval. It's a recognition for the 52 million Americans who are excited about this and hopefully more in the future. But would it have been better if it had followed a more typical process, if it had been held to the same standard as other ETFs? Absolutely. I mean, we have our own case with the SEC for better or worse. That's not something that we ever really wanted to be in that situation. But if we're not going to get clear rules from the regulator, unfortunately, we may have to avail ourselves of the court to get case law created. The court's played a big role, as you mentioned, in these ETFs. And then ultimately, I think we're going to have to look to Congress to pass new laws because ultimately that's where the regulators derive their authority. And I think it's pretty clear at this point that we do need new laws on the book to clarify some of these outstanding issues around what's a commodity, what's a security, the different types of market structures that could apply to crypto.
The last couple of hours have just been a complete blur. When we got that phone call yesterday that our 19B4 had been approved and our S3 had been deemed effective, it was almost an out-of-body experience.
You knew it was coming.
You know, I think we knew it was coming. We were optimistic. We were steadfast in our conviction around this. But this is really the culmination of 10 years of work. Investor support, the Grayscale team, everybody's been working tirelessly towards this outcome.
Okay, so what does this fundamentally mean, though, for Grayscale?
It means it's the beginning of having GBTC trade on the New York Stock Exchange, right? We've now have a whole family of investment products that have been following a very prescribed life cycle from private placement now all the way to ETF. GBTC is the first of those products to do that. And now the rest of the Grayscale family of products can start to move along that continuum as well.
Question, though.
So Amazon is laying off hundreds of workers. This is across Prime Video and its MGM Studios divisions, as well as Twitch. Memos were sent to staffers this morning and obtained by CNBC.com. Our Annie Palmer there. An Amazon spokesperson did confirm those layoffs. The head of Prime and Prime Video and MGM saying in that memo that the company is making some of the cuts to prioritize investments for the long term and the success of the business. The memo goes on to say that they are looking to reduce investments in certain areas and then focus on more high-impact areas. Not just Prime Video, though, also 500 Twitch employees. Another memo obtained by CNBC this morning. Executives saying that we have to work to do and right-size our company. They say they regret that they need to share this news. It's a painful step, of course, and they're reducing headcount by just over 500 people across Twitch as well. Guys, this adds to years of layoffs for Amazon. Starting at the end of 2022, Amazon had its biggest round of layoffs, about 27,000 people across almost every part of that business.
I wasn't surprised by this event, and I was just greatly relieved that it wasn't catastrophic. Had this happened 5 minutes later when they were at a higher altitude, it could have had much more dire consequences. So I think the lesson here is it's really an opportunity to hold Boeing accountable. I appreciate David Calhoun coming out with a statement today saying he's going to be transparent, and the company is. But so far, over the last many years, that hasn't been the case. So I don't think that's enough. I think we need a congressional hearing and investigation into this and into the culture at Boeing, into what's happening at the board level, what's happening at the CEO level, and the decisions that are being made that continue to lead to these kinds of events.
Look, Jim, I can't comment on any, specific deals, but more what I'd say is that our overall M&A strategy, when you look at the deals we announced yesterday, is really to focus on sub $5 billion assets. We announced 4 deals yesterday, all in the kind of sub $1 billion space. Now, we look at larger deals, which is why I think you see the media coverage. It's always something that we do, and we have an obligation to do that. But I really want to highlight, while we look at larger deals, our M&A strategy is bolt-ons. We did 15 deals last year, all under $3 billion. And that's where our overall idea is to build a portfolio of medicines for the future.
And that was the news shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the military shorts.
The U.S. and the U.K. just conducted a massive airstrike campaign on the Houthis tonight, with their operation supported by the Netherlands, Australia, Canada, and Bahrain. They hit more than a dozen targets, ranging from radars to training camps and airports to drone and missile sites. They use fighter jets, warships, and submarines. They also use Tomahawk cruise missiles on the Houthis, with a U.S. official telling VOA, "We hit them pretty hard and pretty good." And President Biden saying tonight was a clear message that the U.S. and its allies won't tolerate attacks on their personnel, on the freedom of navigation, or their commercial vessels, and adding that it won't hesitate to do it again. And this is the Houthis have been warned over 10 times, including a final warning to stop attacking international shipping, but they continued. But they said they won't call this so-called American aggression go unanswered, and that their response will be greater than anything they've done before. But if you play stupid games, you should expect to win stupid prizes. So follow to stay in the loop.
The further you get away from that, I start wondering what you're doing. There's one guy in particular that I think about that I killed. He was the second guy I killed in this house. I entered the house, killed the guy in the front. I went into a bedroom. I did a one-man entry because I'm an idiot. And there was a guy that was in bed with his wife, and I gave him the courtesy of calm down. You're waking up. Just obviously a guy with a green face is in your room and it's scary. Calm down. And there's a fucking AK-47 next to him. I'm like, come on, don't do that. And he went for it. I blasted him, killed him, and then his wife sees it. So I just shot this guy next to his wife, and you start to wonder, like, now the only reason I shot that guy is because I am in his house and we were born on two separate parts of the planet. Yeah. And I don't know him. And then, the further you get away from it, it's like, what if we had met somewhere else, like in a coffee shop in France? Would we have shared a joke? Was he funny?
Lead me, follow me, or get out of my way. A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. A pint of sweat will save a gallon of blood. The object of war is not to die for your country, but to make the other bastard die for his. Courage is fear holding on a minute longer. On motivation and fear. You are not all going to die. Only 2% of you right here today would die in a major battle. Never tell people how to do things. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity. Do more than is required of you. An army is a team. It lives, sleeps, eats, and fights as a team. This individual heroic stuff is pure horse shit. Pressure makes diamonds. On life and achievement, the test of a man is not what he does when he is on top. Success is how high you bounce when you hit bottom. Better to fight for something than live for nothing. Anyone in any walk of life who is content with mediocrity is untrue to himself and American tradition. War is terrible, but it is also magnificent. Ostentatiously do your damnedest all the time.
His tour of duty was up, but he asked for a 6-month extension. He wasn't ready to leave the 1st Marine Division's 5th Marine Regiment in South Vietnam's Quang Tri province quite yet. He was Navy Chaplain Lieutenant Commander Vincent Capodanno, but he was better known as the Grunt Padre to his men. On September 4th, 1967, Capodanno left the safety of company command post to aid another platoon that was being overrun by enemy forces. He ran through a hailstorm of bullets and mortars to get to the platoon under attack, where he moved around the battlefield, giving last rites to the dying and aid to the wounded. His right hand was blown off, but he refused medical attention and continued ministering to the Marines. He noticed a wounded Marine directly in the line of fire. As he got to within inches of him, he was felled by enemy fire and died at the scene. For his heroism, he was posthumously awarded the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Silver Star, and Medal of Honor.
Lots of people that show up to Navy SEAL training have the same story that I did. Didn't really do anything out of high school, screwed up college, got kicked out, didn't have a job. No one in my family has a history of being in the military. Just seemed cool. Decided to go try out. There's loads of people that go to SEAL training that are like super accomplished people, but they wash out really, really quickly. The folks that come in that are like, I've done nothing with my life and this is what I want to do. I'm going to reinvent myself. They got nothing to lose because they've never done anything. But if you're the professional swimmer, the professional football player, people expect you to become a Navy SEAL. And as soon as it gets hard, the instructors remind them that it doesn't matter what you did before. It only matters what you're doing now. The people that have been massively successful before becoming SEALs, they're not used to failing. Just about anybody can go try out. And it's whoever is at the end is a Navy SEAL. And I love the idea of whoever you were before you became a SEAL gets replaced with the person who becomes a SEAL.
If a barricade landing looks dangerous, that's because it is. It's a last resort that leaves no room for backing out if things go wrong. One F-4 crew found that out the hard way when trying to land on the USS Independence in the mid-1970s. First, they went in for a normal landing, but after nearly hitting the ramp, they were forced to pull up and try again. But the problem was, one of their main landing gears had snapped off when they collided with the ramp. That's when they decided to set up the barricade. Despite flying in near total blackness, the pilot made a perfect approach. He shut off the engines at just the right moment before touching down and successfully engaged the netting. But the F-4 didn't stop. The broken landing gear sliced right through the barricade's bottom cable, causing the plane to continue its forward motion all the way to the edge of the flight deck and beyond, where it fell into the water. While the RIO ejected safely and was recovered, the pilot was tragically never found.
You know, in Normandy, you had a stench of death in your clothes that you slept in. You're spitting all the time. Some guys chew tobacco. Some guys got their hands on liquor somehow. And when you're seeing bodies every day, like your age, and you look at the condition that many of them are in, you don't forget that.
I charged towards his tank where I had with me in my pocket what's called a gammon grenade, an explosive grenade, an explosive made out of composition C, an explosive device with a firing device that we made up into a hand grenade, and it had the force of, say, 105 millimeter shell. They didn't see me, and I got close enough where I could throw the gammon grenade against the side of the tank. The purpose of that being to disable the movement of the tank, because it was in the tracking device and it was vulnerable. The guy in the turret then went down, the turret was open. I charged up and got up there close enough where I could get in there, and then dropped a hand grenade in there. And I believe that Mark V had a crew of 5 people that were in there when I threw the hand grenade in there. And then it was quiet.
You ever heard the name Doug Zimbach?
Oh, I haven't.
Major Zimbach he was a man amongst men, right? He was called the Lion of Fallujah. Before we went into the city, he stood up on a tank and he said, the dogs of Fallujah will go fat off of feasting up the dead bodies we lay to waste. And that's exactly what happened. I actually have a dog with a hand in its mouth on my kneecap from that deployment. There were so many bodies that they weren't whole after a couple days. Legs, limbs, chunks were missing. You just see dogs running with fucking arms in their mouth, and you're desensitized. And you're like, you can't even make this shit up.
Meet Medal of Honor recipient Earl D. Plumley. August 28, 2013, Sergeant Plumley instantly responded to an enemy attack on Forward Operating Base Ghazni, Province, Afghanistan, that began with an explosion that tore a 60-foot breach in the base's perimeter wall. 10 insurgents wearing Afghan National Army uniforms and suicide vests poured through the breach. Sergeant Plumley and 5 others mounted 2 vehicles and raced toward the explosion. When his vehicle was engaged by enemy fire, Sergeant Plumley reacted instinctively, using his body to shield the driver prior to exiting the vehicle and engaging an enemy insurgent 15 meters to the vehicle's right with his pistol. Without cover and in complete disregard for his own safety, he advanced on the enemy, engaging multiple insurgents with only his pistol. Upon reaching cover, he killed 2 insurgents, one with a grenade and the other by detonating the insurgent's suicide vest using precision sniper fire. Again, disregarding his own safety, Sergeant Plumley advanced alone against the enemy, engaging several insurgents at close range, including one whose suicide vest exploded a mere 7 meters from his position. Under intense enemy fire, Sergeant Plumley temporarily withdrew to cover, where he joined up with another soldier, and together, they mounted another counterattack. Under fierce enemy fire, Sergeant Plumley again moved from cover and attacked the enemy forces, advancing within 7 meters of a previously wounded insurgent who detonated his suicide vest, blowing Sergeant Plumley back against a nearby wall. Sergeant Plumley, ignoring his injuries, quickly regained his faculties and re-engaged the enemy forces. Intense enemy fire once again forced the 2 soldiers to temporarily withdraw. Undeterred, Sergeant Plumley joined a small group of American and Polish soldiers who moved from cover to once again counterattack the infiltrators. As the force advanced, Sergeant Plumley engaged an insurgent to his front left. He then swung around and engaged another insurgent who charged the group from the rear. The insurgent detonated his suicide vest, mortally wounding a U.S. soldier. Sergeant Plumley, again with complete disregard for his own safety, ran to the wounded soldier, carried him to safety, and rendered first aid. He then methodically cleared the area, remained in a security posture, and continued to scan for any remaining threats. Earl D. Plumley.
That was his Medal of Honor, and that's the military shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now the motivation shorts.
Don't do nothing. That's a big mistake, because all you do is get older and weaker and you withdraw more. And so even if you don't know what to do, pursuing nothing is a very bad idea. You have no hope then, because hope comes from pursuit, and you're anxious because you need to specify a path. So you have no hope and you're anxious if you do nothing. Look, you don't know what to do. So why don't we just look and see what other people do that that seems to work. So you don't know what to do with your life. Well, let's break your life down. Probably you want an intimate partner. Most people do. Now, you might not, but probably you do, even if you think you don't. And so you might be one of those exceptions, but don't assume that to begin with, because that's an uncomfortable place to be if it's true. Now, maybe you're a radically creative genius like Leonardo da Vinci or Picasso, and you're so idiosyncratic that you can't bind yourself to any one person. But, they were 1 in a billion.
Today we will talk about an important topic inspired by the teachings of Saint Pio of Pietrelcina, better known as Padre Pio. He has left us precious advice on how to protect our home and spirit from negative influences. We will explore the 3 individuals you should never allow into your home, according to some valuable teachings of this beloved saint. This video is the result of interpreting the writings, experiences, and imprints left by Padre Pio. Let's start with the first person, the dishonest person. The first person to keep away from your home is the one who practices dishonesty and malice as daily rituals. Padre Pio reminds our hearts that truth and honesty are fundamental in our lives. Every day, we choose to associate with people who operate with uprightness and honesty, avoiding those who could compromise our integrity and faith. Keep the latter away from your home. The second person to keep out of your home is the negative person. This person carries an aura of negativity and pessimism. Padre Pio teaches us that positivity and hope are fundamental elements in our relationship with God and others. Surround yourself with individuals who bring light and inspiration into your life, rather than those who sow doubts and darkness in your soul. The third person you should not allow into your home is the one without respect for faith. This person lacks respect for your faith, path, and spiritual beliefs. Padre Pio taught that it is essential to preserve and nurture our relationship with God. Accept those who respect your faith and protect yourself from those who question or disdain it. Don't invite them into your home. Let us remember the wise words of Padre Pio, that the protection and love of God accompany us in every decision of our daily lives.
I cannot be part of a world where men dress their wives as prostitutes by showing everything that should be cherished. Where there is no concept of honor and dignity, and one can only rely on those when they say, "I promise." Where women do not want children and men don't want a family. Where the suckers believe themselves to be successful behind the wheel of their father's cars, and a father who has a little bit of power is trying to prove to you that you're a nobody. Where people falsely declare that they believe in God with a shot of alcohol in their hand, and the lack of any understanding of their religion. Where the concept of jealousy is considered shameful, and modesty is a disadvantage. Where people forgot about love, but are simply looking for the best partner. Where the boys waste their parents' money in nightclubs, aping under the primitive sounds, and girls fall in love with them for this. I choose my path, but it's a pity that I did not find similar understanding in the people among whom I wish to find it most of all.
And that was the motivational shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the daily laws for January the 17th.
January 17th. The true source of creativity. You must alter your very concept of creativity and try to see it from a new angle. Most often, people associate creativity with something intellectual, a particular way of thinking. The truth is that creative activity is one that involves the entire self, our emotions, our levels of energy, our characters, and our minds. To make a discovery, to invent something that connects with the public, to fashion a work of art that is meaningful, inevitably requires time and effort. This often entails years of experimentation, various setbacks and failures, and the need to maintain a high level of focus. You must have patience and faith that what you are doing will yield something important. You could have the most brilliant mind, teeming with knowledge and ideas, but if you choose the wrong subject or problem to attack, you can run out of energy and interest. In such a case, all of your intellectual brilliance will lead to nothing. Daily law. Work at what connects to you emotionally, and ideas will come to you. Mastery, Chapter 5. Awaken the dimensional mind, the creative active.
And that was the Daily Laws for January 17th from the book The Daily Laws by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Bishop Robert Barron.
You're not just dumbly here or a result of a cosmic accident. No, you've been willed into existence by God. Why did he create you? Because he's got a mission for you. Hey, it might not be what the world thinks is important. Who cares? What's your mission from God? It might be the quietest thing. It's little in the eyes of the world, but great in the eyes of God. Now, here's the point. Once you understand what that is, move, act. Don't procrastinate. Don't fall asleep. Go in haste. Don't waste time. Life is short, and the mission is clear. Be about the work the Lord has given you to do.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, the perception of reality, the learning of facts, the ability to distinguish truth from falsehood are exclusively individual capacities. The mind is an exclusively individual affair. There's no such thing as a collective brain. And intellectual integrity, the refusal to sacrifice one's mind and one's knowledge of the truth to any social pressures, is a profoundly and properly selfish attitude, unquote. And that was the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now we're going to pick up where we left off on the 33 strategies of war.
In the crisis leading up to the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon's advisors and marshals had thought only of retreat. Sometimes it is better, they believed, to accept a setback willingly and go on the defensive. On the other side stood the Tsar and his allies, who had Napoleon weak. Whether they waited to envelop him or attacked right away, they were on the offensive. In the middle was Napoleon, who, as a strategist, stood far above both his own advisors and marshals on the one hand, and the Tsar and alliance generals on the other. His superiority lay in the fluidity of his thinking. He did not conceive war in mutually exclusive terms of defense and offense. In his mind, they were inextricably linked. A defensive position was the perfect way to disguise an offensive maneuver, a counterattack. An offensive maneuver was often the best way to defend a weak position. What Napoleon orchestrated at Austerlitz was neither retreat nor attack, but something far more subtle and creative. He fused defense and offense to set up the perfect trap. First, having taken Vienna, Napoleon advanced to Austerlitz, apparently taking the offensive. That startled the Austrians and Russians, even though they still heavily outnumbered him. Next, he backed off and took a defensive position. Then he seemed to switch between offense and defense, giving every appearance of confusion. In his meeting with the Tsar's emissary, he seemed confused personally as well as strategically. It was all high drama, staged by Napoleon to make him look weak and vulnerable, inviting attack. These maneuvers fooled the Allies into giving up prudence, striking out at Napoleon with total abandon and exposing themselves in the process. Their defensive position at Olmütz was so strong and dominant that only leaving it would ruin it. And that was precisely what Napoleon lured them into doing. Then, instead of defending himself against their rash attack, he suddenly switched to the offensive himself, the counterattack. In doing so, he altered the dynamic of the battle not only physically, but psychologically. When an attacking army suddenly has to go on the defensive, its spirit crumbles. And indeed, the Alliance troops panicked, retreating to the frozen lakes that Napoleon had intended as their graveyard all along. Most of us only know how to play either offensively or defensively. Either we go into attack mode, charging our targets in a desperate push to get what we want, or we try frantically to avoid conflict, and if it is forced on us, to ward off our enemies as best we can. Neither approach works when it excludes the other. Making offense our rule, we create enemies and risk acting rashly and losing control of our own behavior. But constant defensiveness backs us into a corner, becomes a bad habit. In either case, we are predictable. Instead, consider a third option, the Napoleonic way. At times you seem vulnerable and defensive, getting your opponents to disregard you as a threat, to lower their guard. When the moment is right and you sense an opening, you switch to the attack. Make your aggression controlled and your weakness a ploy to disguise your intentions. In a dangerous moment, when those around you see only doom and the need to retreat, that is when you smell an opportunity. By playing weak, you can seduce your aggressive enemies to come at you full throttle. Then catch them off guard by switching to the offense when they least expect it. Mixing offense and defense in this fluid fashion, you will stay one step ahead of your inflexible opponents. The best blows are the ones they never see coming. From The Art of War by Sun Tzu. However desperate the situation and circumstances, don't despair. When there is everything to fear, be unafraid. When surrounded by dangers, fear none of them. When without resources, depend on resourcefulness. When surprised, take the enemy itself by surprise. Jiu-Jitsu. In 1920, the Democratic Party nominated Ohio Governor James Cox as its candidate to succeed the retiring President Woodrow Wilson. At the same time, it named 38-year-old Franklin Delano Roosevelt as its vice presidential nominee. Roosevelt had served as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Wilson. More important, he was the cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, still very popular after his presidency in the first decade of the century. The Republican nominee was Warren G. Harding, and the campaign was a grueling affair. The Republicans had a lot of money. They avoided talking about the issues and played up Harding's folksy image. Cox and Roosevelt responded to the Republicans by going on a vigorous offensive, basing their campaign on a single issue of Wilson's, American participation in the League of Nations, which they hoped would bring peace and prosperity. Roosevelt campaigned all over the country, delivering speech after speech. The idea was to counter the Republicans' money with sheer effort. But the race was a disaster. Harding won the presidency in one of the biggest landslides in American electoral history. The following year, Roosevelt was stricken with polio and lost the use of his legs. Coming just after the disastrous 1920 campaign, his illness marked a turning point in his life. Suddenly made aware of his physical fragility and mortality, he retreated into himself and reassessed. The world of politics was vicious and violent. To win an election, people would do anything, stooping to all kinds of personal attacks. The public official moving in this world was under pressure to be as unscrupulous as everyone else and survive as best he could. But that approach did not suit Roosevelt personally, and took too much out of him physically. He decided to craft a different political style, one that would separate him from the crowd and give him a constant advantage. In 1932, after a stint as governor of New York, Roosevelt ran as the Democratic presidential nominee against the Republican incumbent, Herbert Hoover. The country was in the midst of the Depression, and Hoover seemed incapable of dealing with it. Given the weakness of his record, a defensive hand was a difficult one for him to play. And like the Democrats in 1920, he went vigorously on the offensive, attacking Roosevelt as a socialist. Roosevelt, in turn, traveled the country, speaking on his ideas for getting America out of the Depression. He didn't give many specifics, nor did he respond to Hoover's attacks directly. but he radiated confidence and ability. Hoover, meanwhile, seemed shrill and aggressive. The Depression would probably have doomed him to defeat whatever he did, but he lost far bigger than expected. The size of Roosevelt's victory, nearly an electoral sweep, surprised one and all. In the weeks following the election, Roosevelt essentially hid from public view. Slowly, his enemies on the right began to use his absence to attack him, circulating speculation that he was unprepared for the challenge of the job. The criticisms became pointed and aggressive. At his inauguration, however, Roosevelt gave a rousing speech, and in his first months in office, now known as the 100 Days, he switched from the appearance of inactivity to a powerful offensive, hurrying through legislation that made the country feel as if something were finally being done. The sniping died. Over the next few years, this pattern repeatedly recurred. Roosevelt would face resistance. The Supreme Court, say, would overturn his programs. And enemies on all sides, Senator Huey Long and labor leader John L. Lewis on the left, Father Charles Coughlin and wealthy businessmen on the right, would launch hostile campaigns in the press. Roosevelt would retreat, ceding the spotlight. In his absence, the attacks would seem to pick up steam, and his advisors would panic. But Roosevelt was just biding his time. Eventually, he knew, people would tire of these endless attacks and accusations, particularly because, by refusing to reply to them, he made them inevitably one-sided. Then, usually a month or two before election time, he would go on the offensive, defending his record and attacking his opponents suddenly and vigorously enough to catch them all off guard. The timing would also jolt the public, winning him their attention. In the periods when Roosevelt was silent, his opponents' attacks would grow and grow more shrill. But that only gave him material he could use later, taking advantage of their hysteria to make them ridiculous. The most famous example of this came in 1944, when that year's Republican presidential nominee Thomas Dewey launched a series of personal attacks on Roosevelt, questioning the activities of his wife, his sons, and even his dog, the Scotch Terrier Fala, whom Dewey accused of being pampered at the taxpayer's expense. Roosevelt countered in a campaign speech, "The Republican leaders have not been content to make personal attacks upon me or my sons. They now include my little dog, Fala. Unlike the members of my family, Fala resents this. When he learned that the Republican fiction writers had concocted a story that I left him behind on an Aleutian island and had sent a destroyer back to find him, at a cost to the taxpayers of $2 or $3 or $8 or $20 million, his Scotch soul was furious. He has not been the same dog since. I am accustomed to hearing malicious falsehoods about myself, but I think I have the right to object to libelous statements about my dog."
And that was the next part of Chapter 9, Turn the Tables, from the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. So now a little bit of Stuart Varney here on Monday, January the 15th, and he's going to talk with an analyst, a stock analyst, about Tesla stock.
Futures down fractionally across the board. I mean a fraction. Keith Fitz joins us now. I want to talk about Tesla. Would you buy the stock if it dropped below $200?
No question about it, Stuart. I would hopefully be smart enough to buy a whole lot more of the stock if it drops under $200.
That's a dip you would buy?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I already hold a fair chunk of it, and I'm looking to add to positions. You know, this stock has got hundreds of billions of dollars worth of charging network. It's got AI. It's got the world's largest autonomous driving database. You know, this stock, I think, is going to double or triple in value in the next few years.
But
so far, this analyst, Keith, has expressed certainty of knowledge. He says, would you buy it? Absolutely, I would buy it. It's this, it's that, it's the other thing. His whole tone is, I'm certain about Tesla. So now what the bloody tourist Stuart Varney is about to do is go ahead and try to punch holes in his certainty. He's not going to argue about Tesla, which is the subject. What he's going to try and do is get Keith to hedge his bet, so to speak. Here we go.
It faces extraordinary competition now from Chinese imports. It faces legal challenges. And Elon Musk, is always in the news and not always in a good way. Doesn't that pull you back a little bit?
That last point is the one that concerns me. But visionaries are always like that, and you've got to make a bet here as an investor. My belief is that the company is going to set the bar for a long time to come. I may be, completely wrong on this, but I don't think so because...
There we go. That's what he was looking for, Stuart Varney and everybody, because everybody's been brainwashed into going after certainty of knowledge. When he came out and he said, I might be wrong on this, he shouldn't have handled it that way. What he should have done is tell Mr. Varney, excuse me, there's nothing to argue about. Okay, when he comes out and says, but, Stuart Varney says, but this, but that, but the other thing. Okay, and Keith should have just simply said, look, I factored all that in. There's nothing to argue about. Tesla. The true conservative supports certainty of knowledge. Why? Because there's nothing but certainty. The left wants to brainwash you into believing that there is no certainty of knowledge. They're wrong. Absolutely wrong. There's nothing but certainty of knowledge. But this is how they get to you. Anytime you express certainty of knowledge, they're not going to go after you on the subject matter. It's not Tesla that he's trying to suggest, that Stuart Varney's suggesting that maybe he shouldn't buy, for instance. He just wants to hear Keith say, well, I could be wrong. Okay, you don't have to do that. You just simply stand your ground. You say, Tesla's my stock, that's it, nothing to argue about. And there's nothing they can do about it. Back in a minute. Thank you. So we got the budget situation again. Supposedly there's a budget deal that's been ironed out and that it's now in the Senate and that they're working out the details on the Senate side. And what it's going to do is a short-term spending gap, and it's supposed to kick things back over into March. There'll be two situations, one in say, March the 1st and the other one on March the 8th. Something like that. They're a week apart. It's because we got two now, the one they're dealing with right now, and then in February, there's another short-term spending gap that they got to deal with. Now, there's people that are upset because the Speaker of the House supposedly reneged on a promise. And again, let's go back and review what's the proper way to handle this politically. The proper way not to handle it is to become a lightning rod, is to come out and say, well, I hate the Speaker and I think I'm going to vote to have him removed and he sucks and his bill sucks. That's not the way to do it. You then become the lightning rod. You become the person with the kick me sign on their back. The issue is no longer the budget. The issue is no longer the Speaker of the House. It becomes you. Might be good for your reelection prospects. Maybe, maybe not. But it's going to be ineffective in terms of crafting legislation. The better way to do this is to say, hey, hi, I'm Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I've been given assurances by the Speaker that this, that, and the other thing are going to be in the bill, that this is the way it's going to work, and as long as that's the case, I'm going to check it before I vote, but as long as that's the case, I'm voting for the bill. Okay, now, all the pressure is now on the Speaker. Okay, and if it comes out, of course, that it doesn't have what you want in it, you can hold a press conference and say, I'm really disappointed. I was promised X, Y, and Z, and they lied to me. And again, more pressure on the Speaker. Put the pressure on the Speaker. Another thing that they could do is simply threaten. Marjorie Taylor Greene could do this as just as an aside. You know what? Next time somebody sticks a microphone in her face, you know what? There's a rumor going around that Republicans in our caucus are so fed up with the getting lied to and getting getting the runaround on this budget process, that they're looking to resign en masse, dozens of representatives at a time. And I'm thinking of joining that, but we'll see. And you leave it at that. They, of course, want details. You're very vague and hazy on it, or none of your business, or whatever. Now, again, this pressure goes to the speaker, right? So the speaker has to answer. People are going to ask him, is this an indictment of your leadership? How many people are looking to resign? Why would they be looking to resign? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He now has to answer. The pressure is on him and the process where it belongs. So the point here is, just because you're a conservative doesn't mean you have to hang a kick me sign on your back. Back in a minute. Thank you. So another thing on the budget. This is the way it works from the Republican standpoint. The Republicans want the budget to go through, whether it's a stopgap. They really don't care. They just don't want to get hammered politically. This is a political year. And if this budget, if there's a shutdown, they're too stupid and too gutless to do anything about what they know is coming, which is the Democrats making big hay about the budget shutdown, right? So Republicans' fault. So their attitude is, let's just get it out of the way so that we can get to the election and create a new majority or whatever. The problem is, of course, that hurts their base. Their base is upset, and if their base doesn't turn out, they're not getting elected to anything anyhow, okay? So what happens then is they need somebody, because if everybody gets all upset, and again, if the base gets upset, they may lose votes. So how do you keep them on the reservation, so to speak? You trot out somebody that is going to cool off the marks, because you and I are looked at as simply as marks. And that person is Rand Paul. He does it every single time. Every time there's a budget impasse and the budget is resolved in a way that we don't like, they trot out Rand Paul, who says, I feel your pain, but there's nothing we can do about it. It's the same message every time. Okay? He doesn't feel our pain, and there's all kinds of things we can do about it. So don't believe it, but watch. Whenever it gets close to the budget time, Rand Paul starts getting on to talk shows. You'll see him on TV a lot, so that when we get to the critical moment where a budget is agreed to that the base doesn't like, he can be there to cool off the marks. Hey, I understand, I feel your pain, but there's nothing we can do. You watch. Back in a minute. Thank you. So, listening to the radio, the John Phillips show on KABC, they're playing a segment where an individual is asking a congresswoman about a piece of legislation that she wants to get passed about basically reforming the Senate and probably all of Congress, so that senators and congressmen cannot trade stocks and basically profit off of their positions. And so Alex Stone asked her a question, but really what it was he says, how do you expect to get this passed in the Senate when everybody makes their money or their profits on these things that you want to do away with? What he's doing here is not asking a question. He's engaging her in a debate under the guise of asking her a question. The way she should have responded was to say, excuse me, is that a question or a statement? Okay, make him phrase it in the form of a question. Get him out of the debate mode. Or you can confront him and say, excuse me, are you trying to debate with me? Put him on the spot. Just because somebody asks you a question doesn't mean you have to answer it. doesn't mean it's the right question, doesn't mean it's the smart question. So you listen to your conscience. If your conscience, when somebody's asking you a question, says something's wrong here, something's wrong. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now we pick up where we left off with None Braver. This is an account of a writer that went to Afghanistan to report about the activities of the United States Air Force pararescuemen.
Perish yourself, but rescue your comrade. Field Marshal Alexander V. Suvorov, 1729 to 1800. Prologue. The worst day of his life. March 5th, 2002. It was barely 6:30 in the morning, and it was already the worst day of Major Vincent Savino's life. An hour earlier, the Brooklyn-born commander of the Air Force's relatively new all-PJ 38th Rescue Squadron had reported to the wing commander's office at Moody Air Force Base near Valdosta, Georgia, wearing his dress blue uniform for the first time in months. The casualty assistance team was already there, ready to brief Savino, Brigadier General John H. Folkerts, commanding general of the 347th Rescue Wing, Protestant chaplain Lieutenant Colonel Jerry Pitts, and Flight Surgeon Major Mary Brugenmeyer on the protocol for notifying an airman's wife that her husband would not be coming home alive from the war on terrorism. It was still dark when they left the base on the 20-minute drive to the apartment complex where the young pararescueman had lived with his family. The general had unexpectedly chosen not only to make the onerous trip with the major, but had also chosen to drive. That was just as well because Savino couldn't keep his mind from racing. Yesterday morning, he'd been down at the headquarters of AFSOC, the Air Force Special Operations Command, at Hurlburt Field, Florida, when word came that a combat controller, CCT, and a pararescueman, PJ, had been killed in Operation Anaconda. By early afternoon, one of his lieutenants had called from the Rescue Coordination Center in Uzbekistan with word that one of the dead was a PJ from the 38th. Savino immediately returned to Moody to await official word, and General Folkerts had received a confirming call from the commanding general of Joint Special Operations Forces at Bagram. The 38th had been lending pararescuemen to AFSOC since December. The career field has always been undermanned. With a war being fought, that shortage had become acute, and AFSOC was begging, borrowing, and stealing PJs from the Air Force Reserve, the Air National Guard, as well as from active-duty rescue units like the 38th that technically weren't special tactics outfits. Savino recalled that months earlier he'd sat down in the unit's conference room with the PJs chosen to go on the next deployment to Afghanistan. Their wives sat at their sides, listening intently. "Okay, this is for real," he remembers telling them. "This isn't the Northern Watch or the Southern Watch." Many of his guys had been detailed to units based in Kuwait or at Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, ready to rescue the jet pilots who were patrolling the northern and southern no-fly zones in Iraq. It was stultifying, mind-numbing duty. In a dozen years of standing watch, no pilot had ever gone down and required rescuing. "This is combat," Savino had lectured. "There's stuff going on right now. Make sure your wills are up to date. Make sure we know who to notify if something happens." He knew that when husbands get overseas, wives often pack up the kids and go home to their parents or in-laws. He wanted to make sure the unit knew how to find the families if something untoward should happen. Savino wasn't being dramatic. He wasn't being an alarmist. He was merely acknowledging that he knew his men would do their jobs, would uphold their credo, and that the consequences of that level of dedication to duty could be dire. Even as Savino and the general had been working the phones to try to confirm the reports, wives of unit PJs in Operation Enduring Freedom were calling the base. They'd seen news of the battle on CNN, knew that Americans had died, and wanted to be sure their husbands were still alive. They were told that there was no information available yet. Until the name came through channels, no one was going to tell a wife that her husband was dead. Mistakes happen in combat. Messages get garbled in transmission. It's a mistake Savino wasn't ready to risk. Besides, he was still in a state of personal disbelief. It couldn't be one of his guys. In the past, he had lost men to training accidents and during civilian rescues, Theirs was a dangerous business, and risks were routinely accepted. But it never got any easier. The PJ community is a small one where every loss is personal, but this was more so. He remembered the session he'd had the day before 6 of his PJs were to leave for Afghanistan. It was just with their wives. She was sitting right there in that chair, and she looked at me and said, "Everything's going to be okay, right?" And I said, "They'll be fine. We'll take care of the guys." And that just kept playing through my mind, you know. Here I am, sitting here telling everybody that everything's going to be all right. And then you got to go back and knock on their door the next morning and tell her, "Hey, your husband's not coming home." By early evening, they knew unofficially who had been killed. Still, it was not good enough to make a formal notification. General Folkert's concern was that someone in the unit would hear through the grapevine who had died, and, unaware that formal notification had not been made, would, with the best of intentions, call the widow. By midnight, they'd received official word, including details about the circumstances of the young man's death, and had been given authorization to make the notification. But Savino and Folkerts agreed that it would be best not to awaken the young woman now. Both agreed that they'd have to do it very early in the morning. They couldn't risk having the wife wake up and learn about it from CNN. That's why the phone rang in Dr. Brugenmeyer's home at 3 in the morning, ordering her to report at 0400 wearing dress blues to the base personnel center for a briefing, and then go to the commanding general's office. During the phone call, all they told her was that there was a casualty on base. At personnel, she learned a bit more from the chaplain and the mortuary affairs officer. The casualty had occurred in the war overseas, but no details were available about what had actually caused the death. The doctor was given information about the family of the deceased, his wife and children, and since she had never done this before, was told that the reason for taking a flight surgeon along as part of the notification team was to be ready in the event any urgent situation might arise, such as a complete hysteria-type reaction where sedatives or some type of resuscitation might be needed. An hour later, when the entire team, including Major Savino, assembled in General Folkert's office, they double-checked their information about the family, where they lived, how to get there, and, most important of all, make sure everybody knew what their role was going to be when they got there. Emotions were to be kept in check. Only limited information could be passed along, such as where the airman's body was at that time, when his body would be coming home, where he would be taken. The mood, as would be expected, was somber. But it was also tense. This was not an everyday occurrence, and everyone wanted to do it right. The general made it clear that he would lead the team, that he would do the talking. He'd made his first casualty notification as a young captain. He'd watched a video the Air Force provided on how to do it, what to say, and, more important, what not to say. But neither experience nor training drains the emotion from a moment like this. At about 0610, they left in the general's official car, out the main gate, made a left turn onto Bemis Highway for several miles, then made a right turn down a 2-lane road past a series of apartment complexes. In the back seat, watching the sun begin to rise on this clear late winter morning, sat Vinnie Savino, Air Force Academy graduate, Special Tactics Officer, Combat Control Officer, and now a pioneering combat rescue officer in command of his own rescue squadron, embarked on the most painful duty of his career. Seated next to him, the chaplain quietly voiced a prayer, beseeching the Lord to help this woman and her 2 young children, and an added plea on their own behalf that the kids would still be asleep when they arrived at their apartment. Savino never felt the chill in the still, sub-freezing air as he walked with the others from the car, casting a brief backward glance at the second vehicle in this poignant procession, where his own wife, Maria, the wife of the unit's chief master sergeant, as well as the wife of another PJ, waited to take over the job of providing comfort and support once the official notification team departed. In the Air Force, dealing with life and death is a family affair. As they got out of the car at 0630, the 4 high-ranking officers in dress blues shocked a young airman who lived upstairs, above the PJ's family, and who was just leaving for work. Up the concrete walkway they strode, Brigadier General Folkerts in the lead, each of them struggling to find the impossible, words capable of cushioning the blow. How do you tell a 30-year-old mother of 2 preschoolers, even one who happens to be a Navy veteran and is herself in the Air Force ROTC program at Valdosta State University, that her husband has the distinction of becoming the first pararescueman to die in combat since Vietnam? As the general knocked on the apartment door, running through his mind was the thought that his country was truly at war. His men were at war, and he had the prescient notion that this death might just be number one in a series. At that moment, they all knew that the pararescue credo, that others may live, would be tested time and again before the war was won.
And that was Chapter 2 of the book None Braver by Michael Hirsch. And next Wednesday will be Chapter 3. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.